Okay, I'm going to do some stuff with Knime here. I'm showing where I've been using some data analytics tools on astrology, because you can do that. First of all, this is Knime. It's free. You can download it. It's pretty awesome. Support the developers if you can. Uh, so what I've done, let me show you this, is take a file from Astro Data Bank and some other sources, and it has the names of all these people. I don't know if you can see that. Can't zoom in here, but it shows all these people, and it's got their traits and stuff. And then what I've done is I've taken angles of separation and divided them into harmonics. So for example, this column is Veritas Mars, and these are the angles between the asteroid Veritas and the planet Mars. And right here we have a 3. That means that this particular person has a Veritas Mars trine. It's a third harmonic. Anyway, so I just want to note that when you do data analysis like this, you don't really say that uh, these things are, for example, 90 degrees apart or 94.5 degrees apart. Instead, you say they are 1/4 of a circle or 1/3 of a circle, and then you put either the 4 or the 3 in there, and that makes this data nominal. Okay, so I do a bunch of document processing here in Knime. Don't have to worry about the gray stuff. But at the end, I have some major statistical tests. Now, excuse the rest of this. I'm still playing around with Knime. But I'm going to draw your attention to this one and this one, the linear regression and the logistic regression. Basically, these are ways to determine what your categories are for different kinds of traits and different kinds of planet pairs. I use linear regression to find well, it says here, the weights that associate certain planet pairs with a specific trait. So if I go in here to configure, it looks like I was looking for parenting, because we do text analysis on that document that I showed you, and it assigns basically a frequency weight to the mention of parenting as a category. And then you can say which of these planet pairs, if any, assign, well, help change the frequency rate for the mention of parenting. And when I run that, you can get various results. Let's go over to Excel and look at a couple of the results that I got. So when I ran linear regression, I did it on various categories, and I ran it on categories like those who were described as having the trait gorgeousness. And apparently, a midheaven Hera opposition was statistically significant. So we've got our p-value here. It's statistically significant at the 0.01 level for influencing gorgeousness. And then, of course, you can replicate this on a different data set. But other things that helped influence gorgeousness were Zelia midheaven, midheaven vertex, and so on. Now, what do all these numbers mean? This last column is the chance that your results were random. So you want this number to be really low. And I use the 0.01 level since we're dealing with thousands of records here. Now look at this one. This is like a big, big deal. And it says a lot about the attribute gorgeousness. What does gorgeousness mean as far as behavior is concerned? Because we have our overt traits, you know, like your sex or your race or things like that. But those overt traits can be thought of as projections which influence other people's behavior. And so when you're walking around with a big, like, you know, fancy hair thing going, um, that's a way of drawing attention. The trait would be your hair, but the effect would be the attention that you draw. Now, I think this is really interesting, Azalea Midheaven 26, because if you looked at my books, Full Spectrum Astrology, then you know that 26s are where you require fans. Zelia, by the way, is the asteroid of blocking things out and regulating. It's a shield asteroid, protects you. And the midheaven is your public reputation. These people need to shield themselves when issuing their public reputation among fans and followers. This was highly statistically significant. We're talking like 0.0000002. That's that tells you that when people have traits like this, they often have to shield themselves from the public. And then there's some other stuff that you can conclude. Now, I also thought that the linear regression I performed on criminality was interesting because so much of criminality depended on the calculated point of blessed talent, which is Selene. We don't think of people being criminal as being criminal because they're exercising a talent that they're good at in front of the public. But that's exactly what this suggests. Now, it turns out that having a blessed talent on the public actually doesn't make you more likely to be criminal. These coefficients are negative, and because they're negative, it's basically showing that when your blessed talent is talked about in the public among other people, or when it leaves a vibe on other people, or when you can express it one-to-one in your interactions, or your communication, or your influence, it's kind of like saying you have an acceptable outlet for your talents, and you are less likely to have criminality describe you. You're more likely to have it describe you if you represent something bigger than yourself, that's the asteroid Veritas, in the public eye by dominating a room or with your friends. If you're known for friends who represent something bigger than themselves, it's funny. These are kind of like your individual criminals who come in and dominate a room representing your karma or whatever people have earned. And these are like your institutional criminals. They and their friends come into your place and do corrupt things or whatever. Okay, there's also some stuff on parenting. I don't want to go in that. Let's go back to Knime and show the logistic regression. Now, unlike linear regression, instead of having a bunch of categories influence how you appear in a particular weighted measure with a continuous variable, logistic regression shows how a bunch of categories influence where you appear with a binomial, I think it's bimodal, anyway, a dichotomous, that's what it's called, a dichotomous variable. So what I do in here is I develop a rule and I say either you have this particular trait or you don't. And let me go ahead and change the rule so you can see how this works and how I do this. How's my time? Pretty good. Okay, so my rule, for example, is going to be sun moon square. I'm going to change this to sun moon equals 4, a fourth harmonic, because I haven't run that kind of data yet. What this does is say if the person in the row had a sun moon square, then I say yes in this new column, and if they didn't, I say no. Okay, this resets all the nodes, and now I'm going to go ahead and execute these things. So this logistic regression is basically going to say either you have a square or you don't. And when you have a square in between your sun and moon, these are all the weightings that are significant, so we can say that we've met kind of the criterion for some more decent science than just guessing. Now, while that's running, I want to show you one of the results, a collection of my results from the logistic regression, because this is kind of interesting. When I ran the logistic regression on sun-moon conjuncts, oh my goodness, let me hide this. When I ran the logistic regression on sun-moon conjuncts, I found that the topics associated with it were being noted, having something to do with siblings, and having something to do with film, but you were less likely to be a director. What does that tell us about sun-moon? Nothing. Unless you find some kind of common characteristic here. What about sun-moon oppositions? When I ran a logistic regression on that, I found that it had to do with abuse, Oscar, fame, or historical. Now these are all more material, and that lines up with what oppositions are about. So these are the material versions of whatever, some kind of achievement. What about this one? These are Sun Moon 20s, 2 octiles or Aquarius octiles. People who had Sun Moon 20s were less likely to be fringe. 20s are where you kick butt in the eyes of outside groups. And people who were inclined to have whatever the Sun Moon represents in outside groups also were associated with being presidents, professors, criminals, I guess other kinds of leaders. So you've got something there. Now let's go back to Knime and get the results of this. When I take the results of this, I have let's see, copy here, and I'm going to paste it in, wait a minute, I'm going to paste it inside this last column. Okay, wrap that text, and then I'll, well, wait a minute, let me get my labels back. Here, copy, and then here, and these were Sun Moon squares. Okay, and now let me highlight everything that was statistically significant. First I'll take off this filter, and then put the filter back on. Whoop, wait a minute. Take off this filter, put it back on everybody, and then, oh, I keep doing that. Filter off again. Put that there, put that there. Okay, good. Filter's back. And I'm going to do conditional formatting on this, and I want to test at the 0.01 level. There we go. Now I will sort by color. These are the attributes that were associated with Sun Moon squares. And you see that these guys were more likely, it was because it's positive coefficients, more likely to have Sun Moon squares. And these guys were less likely. Okay, so being associated with entertainment, design, different kinds of affairs here, I don't know what that means. Hall, I don't know what that means either, just as a category, so I'm going to go ahead and unhighlight those. But entertainment and designers, if you had people who, I guess, were associated with perfecting their craft. So you would ask what the square means here. I don't know. There are other ways to test this, but there's not a lot of time in this video. So some things that I've found, by the way, which we're going to need to do if we can get better results from these kinds of analyses, is that as I talk about in my book, Hayden's Book of Synastry, or I think it may have been the third book, 144, there's a problem with relying only on public data to do this. And I know that based on the eyeball method that I used, that Sun Moon shows a measure of your self-contentment. If you didn't know that, you would have to go through all these columns and say, okay, what does the conjunct show? What is the opposition associated with? What is the to opposition associated with? And you can do it statistically, yes, but you'd have to do it one by one, and you don't have the tagged labels that actually describe personal traits. So we don't know whether any of these people were happy with themselves or paranoid or stuff. You only know if their paranoia was there on a level that made it public. Because words like entertainment don't really describe personality traits as heavily, we're not going to be able to get at what most of these data are talking about. So it's kind of surprising that Sun Moon even produces any significant results, because these are all public traits. And when we only have public traits to rely on, you can imagine that a lot of the data that comes out of it is not going to be good, because so much of our lives, 2/3 of our life, are either private or interpersonal. What I would suggest for future research is that we go about creating a tag for these things. So for example, what kind of attributes tend to describe people who are entertainers or designers? They have an accepted public role, they have a kind of attention to appearances, or at least they're concerned with it in some way, and so on and so forth. By being able to tag these public traits and assign different kinds of private or interpersonal characteristics to them, we can take this same column of data and produce multiple columns of data and then cross-correlate among those multiple columns of data so that we can extract deeper personality traits even for people who are long dead.